You know, there's a profound and disquieting crisis of meaning in the modern world. People are wandering psychologically, spiritually, rootless, cynical, disoriented. We've unmoored ourselves from tradition, and now we flail in a sea of hyper-individualism, moral relativism, and nihilistic despair. And yet, paradoxically, the hunger for truth remains. The hunger for structure, for redemption, for purpose. It hasn't gone away. It's deeper than ever. We live in an age where the search for truth has become both a personal and cultural crisis. Institutions have lost credibility. Traditions are often dismissed as archaic relics. Yet, in the background, largely unnoticed, there exists a narrative that refuses to die. It's not loud. It doesn't dominate the public square, but it endures. It persists like a whisper through history. Seventh-day Adventism, for many, is a theological footnote, a curious sect or an obscure denomination tucked away in the margins of Christian discourse. But that perception, like so many others in our superficial culture, misses the depth of what's actually there, because what we often call hidden is only hidden to the eyes that refuse to look deeply. Adventism was born in the furnace of disappointment, not in success, not in comfort, but in the disillusionment of a failed prophecy. The great disappointment of 1844 wasn't just a historical event. Psychologically, it was an existential crisis. People who had oriented their entire lives around a promise watched it seemingly collapse. But instead of crumbling, instead of surrendering to despair, something profound happened. They re-examined, they questioned, they wrestled with Scripture. And out of that struggle, out of the ashes, emerged a new understanding of faith. This is not weakness. This is the archetypal hero's journey, the descent into chaos, the confrontation with meaninglessness, and the return with deeper wisdom. Adventism is often misunderstood because it doesn't conform to religious cliches. It doesn't emphasize emotional highs or prosperity theology. It's systematic, structured, prophetic. It sees Scripture not as a buffet of verses to cherry pick, but as an integrated, symbolic whole. It claims that truth is not just an abstract idea, it's a pattern woven into reality. And patterns, by their nature, require discipline to perceive. The Adventist framework, Sabbath, sanctuary, health reform, education, prophecy, it's a map. Not a random collection of doctrines, but a coherent worldview. One that insists that time is sacred, that the body matters, that the future has consequences, and that truth demands response. But here's the tragic irony. The more grounded and consistent something is, the more invisible it becomes to a culture trained to chase novelty. Adventism doesn't shout. It builds. It teaches. It warns. It points not just to personal salvation, but to cosmic order. It tells you that history is not a spiral of chaos, but a narrative with a beginning, a crisis, a resolution. That is an audacious claim in a postmodern world. And because of that, it's easily dismissed by those who can't tolerate meaning that costs something. The hiddenness of Adventism is not evidence of its irrelevance, but of its depth. Depth is hard. Depth takes work. It demands you sacrifice your idols, comfort, pleasure, self-centered spirituality. The hidden church is not hidden because it's false. It's hidden because it requires you to look beneath the surface. The Sabbath is not merely a religious observance. It is a radical act of resistance against the tyranny of modern life. In a world that glorifies productivity, where value is measured in speed, output, and efficiency, the Sabbath interrupts. It says, stop, not as a suggestion, but as a commandment. And that's uncomfortable for a culture addicted to motion. We live under the illusion that constant activity is equivalent to meaning. But meaning doesn't arise from endless work. It arises from purpose, from structure, from the conscious alignment of our lives with something greater than ourselves. The Sabbath, in this context, becomes far more than a day of rest. It becomes a symbol of spiritual defiance. Seventh-day Adventism places the Sabbath not at the periphery of faith, but at its center. Observed from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset, It is grounded in the creation story itself. God works for 6 days, and on the seventh he rests, not out of exhaustion, but to establish rhythm, pattern, order. This is not just theology, it's psychology. Human beings are not designed for endless striving. We are creatures of cycles, of waking and sleeping, of work and renewal. To ignore that is to court chaos. And chaos, whether internal or external, is the enemy of meaning. The secular world has repackaged busyness as virtue. Hustle culture teaches that identity comes from achievement, that rest is laziness, and that downtime is wasted time. But the Sabbath says otherwise. It reclaims time as sacred. It declares that your worth is not tied to your productivity, that you are more than your output, that there is holiness in stillness. This is not escapism. It's realism of the highest order, a confrontation with the limits of human autonomy, because to rest in obedience is to admit that you are not the center of the universe, that the world can go on without you, that you are finite. This has staggering implications. The Sabbath isn't just a personal practice. It's a societal critique. It challenges economic systems that grind people down for profit. It rebukes technological environments that never turn off. It exposes the shallowness of lives consumed by notifications and noise. And it invites something deeper, communion, not just with God, but with others, with family, with community, with nature. The Sabbath slows time. It creates space. It makes room for reflection, for silence, for recalibration. It reminds you that you are not a machine. The Adventist observance of the Sabbath, then, is not a quaint tradition. It is a countercultural revolution. It embodies the truth that true freedom is not the ability to do whatever you want, whenever you want. True freedom is found in disciplined surrender to a higher order, in trusting that the world is held together not by your anxious striving, but by divine rhythm. And in practicing that trust once a week, you realign your entire being, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. We live in a time when the body is either idolized or ignored. On one hand, culture is obsessed with appearance, performance, and pleasure. Endless diets, workouts, enhancements. On the other, the deeper significance of the body, its sacredness, its function, its connection to the spiritual, is often completely dismissed. But the Seventh-day Adventist tradition brings an entirely different perspective. It views the body not as a disposable shell or a vehicle for indulgence, but as a temple, a sacred space where the physical and the spiritual intersect. This is not just metaphor. It's a call to responsibility, to stewardship, to reverence. The Adventist health message doesn't emerge from modern trends in wellness. It was born out of deep theological reflection and practical observation. Long before plant-based diets and holistic health became fashionable, Adventists were already living it. Why? Because they understood something crucial. Your physical choices shape your mental clarity and your spiritual receptivity. You cannot disconnect what you eat, how you rest, or how you move from how you think, feel, and relate to God. That's a radical claim in a fragmented world that compartmentalizes everything. But Adventism says no. This is one life, one body, one system. Health, in this view, is not merely the absence of disease. It's the alignment of the body with its original design. It's about living in harmony with natural law, not in rebellion against it. And rebellion has a cost. Our society is suffering not just from pandemics and obesity, but from stress, anxiety, and depression, all exacerbated by lifestyles that defy balance. The Adventist emphasis on clean eating, exercise, rest, and temperance is not legalism, it's wisdom. It's the recognition that freedom is not doing whatever you want, but doing what is right for the long-term flourishing of your whole being. There's also an implicit morality to caring for the body. If you were given a sacred artifact, something holy and irreplaceable, you wouldn't throw it around or fill it with trash. But how many people treat their bodies that way every day? To honor the body is to affirm that life is not random, that your existence is intentional, And it's a protest again against the nihilism that says nothing matters. Adventism teaches that your body matters because it's part of your calling. It's how you act, how you serve, how you love. It's how your mind functions. It's how your spirit expresses itself. The world tells you that pleasure is the highest good, that discipline is oppression, that you should follow every craving. But the Adventist health message flips that narrative. It says discipline is liberation, that caring for your body is not repression, it's reverence. It's not about fear of punishment, but about respect for design. There's a quiet dignity in living a life of self-control, of intentionality, of physical stewardship. Not to earn God's love, but because you've already received it. And now your body becomes a living response to that grace. When most people hear the word prophecy, they imagine something mystical or superstitious. An old man with a beard predicting doom, or abstract symbols twisted into vague forecasts about the future. But within the framework of Seventh-day Adventism, prophecy is not about escapism or sensationalism. It's about responsibility. It's not there to entertain or frighten. It's there to awaken. Because true prophecy doesn't just tell you what might happen. It tells you what you must do. It confronts you with the moral weight of time, the consequences of action and inaction, and the undeniable reality that history is not random. It is ordered. It is structured. And we are participants in it. Adventist theology places a serious emphasis on the prophetic narrative found in the books of Daniel and Revelation, not as puzzles to decode for the sake of curiosity, but as blueprints that reveal how systems of power, ideology, and belief rise and fall. These prophecies show a world at war with itself, with truth under siege, and with people caught between competing kingdoms, one built on coercion, the other on conscience. That tension is not theoretical, it's existential. And in this view, prophecy isn't merely descriptive, it's diagnostic. It reveals the condition of the soul and the culture. It holds up a mirror and demands you ask, where do I stand? This is a kind of psychological and spiritual reckoning. Prophecy, rightly understood, doesn't give you permission to sit back and wait. It calls you to prepare, to become alert, to strip away illusion. The prophetic voice is a call to moral clarity in a time of confusion. It names injustice when society normalizes it. It calls for reform when religion gets comfortable. And it insists that neutrality is not a moral option. To ignore what is revealed is to choose blindness. The Adventist understanding of prophecy challenges the individual to live differently, not just because of what is coming, but because of what is true. It creates urgency, but not panic. There's a critical distinction. Panic leads to paralysis. Prophetic urgency leads to action, to vigilance, to humility. It's not about knowing exact dates or predicting specific headlines. It's about understanding patterns, how pride corrupts power, how deception mimics truth, how compromise erodes conviction. And these patterns are everywhere, in governments, in religions, in hearts. That is why prophecy matters, because it's not just about the end of the world, it's about the state of your world, your choices, your character, your allegiance. Prophecy, in this context, becomes a moral compass. The compass is not static information, it's dynamic transformation. It doesn't just inform your theology, it shapes your ethics. It demands integrity, because once you know what is unfolding, you can't pretend ignorance. Once you see the trajectory, you can't live as if nothing matters. You are accountable, and that accountability is not rooted in fear, but in truth. A truth that, when seen clearly, exposes lies not just out there, but within. Education is often reduced to the accumulation of information, a means to a job, a credential, a status symbol. But in the Seventh-day Adventist worldview, education is something far more profound. It is the shaping of the whole person, intellect, character, and spirit, into alignment with divine truth. It is not simply about learning facts, but about learning how to live well, how to think critically, how to love truth, and how to discern the difference between the artificial and the authentic. In a world flooded with data and starving for wisdom, this kind of education is revolutionary. It does not just inform, it transforms. The foundation of Adventist education is the belief that all true knowledge begins with God. That means subjects are not isolated silos but interconnected expressions of a unified reality. Science and scripture are not enemies. History and prophecy are not opposites. Everything belongs to a coherent whole. This holistic approach is an act of rebellion against the compartmentalized, fragmented thinking that dominates secular systems. The goal is not just to produce competent workers, but thoughtful citizens of both earth and heaven. It's about training people who can stand for principle, even when it's unpopular, who can resist conformity when the crowd surrenders, who can ask deep questions without losing their moral footing. Adventist schools, from elementary to university level, emphasize values as much as academics. There is a deliberate cultivation of integrity, discipline, compassion, and personal responsibility. This is not incidental. It is central. This is vitally important because the assumption is that education devoid of moral development is dangerous. Intelligence without virtue creates sophisticated corruption. Talent without conscience builds efficient evil. So the classroom becomes more than a place for learning. It becomes a field of character formation. And character, in the biblical sense, is destiny. Not just in the next life, but in this one. There's also a deep psychological insight in this approach. Many educational systems operate on pressure, fear, and competition. But Adventist education is grounded in the belief that identity comes from being a child of God, not from grades or approval. That kind of security creates a different kind of learner. One who is not driven by anxiety, but by purpose. One who studies not to impress, but to understand. This cultivates a mindset that can withstand failure, persevere through difficulty, and remain grounded amid success. It's not about escaping the world, but about preparing to engage it with wisdom and courage. In a time when truth is often treated as relative, when moral confusion is normalized, and when critical thinking is replaced by shallow slogans, this kind of education becomes a form of resistance. It equips people not just to survive the chaos, but to bring clarity into it. It trains minds to seek what is eternal while navigating what is temporal. It raises a generation not only with answers, but with the discernment to know which questions matter most. To be part of something called a remnant is by definition to be small, to be distinct, to be set apart. In the Seventh-day Adventist perspective, the remnant is not about elitism, but about responsibility. It is the belief that in every age of moral collapse and spiritual confusion, there is always a group that refuses to bow, a group that holds to principle when compromise is the norm, a group that, though marginalized, remains faithful. To be part of the remnant is not to escape pressure. It is to stand firm in the face of it. This identity comes with weight. It demands resilience, clarity, and moral courage. In a world obsessed with belonging, with being liked, with avoiding offense, the remnant stands alone. It speaks when silence is easier. It obeys when rebellion is trending. It remembers when the culture forgets. That is not an easy path. It requires a certain kind of character, one formed not in comfort, but in conviction. The remnant identity is forged in the furnace of tension between faithfulness and relevance, between compassion and conviction, between the pressure to conform and the call to stand apart. The psychological cost of this tension is real, but so is the reward, because meaning is not found in going along. It is found in standing for something. The Adventist view of the remnant is not a passive designation. It is not something inherited by association or declared by default. It is something lived. To be the remnant is to carry a message, the everlasting gospel, the call to worship the Creator, the warning against false systems of power and religion. It is not about being superior, but about being faithful. That task includes proclamation, but it also includes embodiment. The message must be lived, not just preached. It must be evident in lifestyle, in relationships, in how one treats time, health, truth, and others. This calling also brings isolation. To live as a remnant is to often feel out of sync with the surrounding world. Your values will clash. Your decisions will confuse others. You will be misunderstood, misrepresented, and occasionally ridiculed. But this experience is not new. The prophets lived it. The apostles endured it. Even Christ himself was the ultimate remnant, standing utterly alone in the moment of greatest moral clarity. To follow that example is not to seek suffering, but to embrace truth, even when it is inconvenient or costly. There is a psychological power in owning this identity. When you understand that you are called not to blend in, but to bear witness, something shifts in your perspective. You stop needing approval to act. You stop negotiating your values for acceptance. You stop fearing the label of different and start embracing the role of a watchman, a messenger, a light in the fog. The remnant is not large. It is not flashy. It is not always welcomed, but it endures. Not through sheer strength, but through deep-rooted conviction and a vision anchored in the eternal.